I'm going to make the molds for the concrete out of white laminate shelf boards that I'm going to cut with my compound miter saw. I cut pieces of 2.5-inch wide vinyl trim board for the side panels. I drilled holes in 2 of the laminate boards that were big enough for a 1-inch diameter iron pipe to go through. I glued the mold together using my hot glue gun. I'm really happy that Ryobi made a hot glue gun. Finally, I have a great hot glue gun that's cordless. I sealed the seams on the sides of the molds with the hot glue gun, but I used silicone sealant on the bottoms because I wanted them to be smooth because they're going to rest on the ground. I inserted the steel pipe and then wrapped some reinforcement wire around it to make reinforcement for the concrete parts. I then screwed on a coupling on the inside of the mold, put on the reinforcement wire, and then hot glued it into place. Now I wanted the 2 concrete molds to be perfectly perpendicular to the bar, so I glued 2 pieces of wood to them that were exactly the same length. I glued some scrap pieces of wood to short pieces of vinyl trim boards to make the indentations for the concrete bench. I used some silicone to seal around the coupling. I mixed a bag of Quikrete 5000 and then poured it into both of the molds. Now I made sure to use a stick to push the wet concrete all the way down into the bottom of the molds and try to vibrate it out as many of the air bubbles as possible. I then screwed in the short pieces of vinyl trim board so that I would have the indentations in the concrete. I let the concrete cure 4 days before removing the mold. I had to drill some holes into the laminate board so I could break it away and pull it off. I bought a sheet of 3/4 inch thick oak veneer plywood from Home Depot, and I had them rip it down to the same width as the concrete. After cutting the pieces to length with my compound miter saw, I then set up a fence and then actually used my circular saw to make 2 cuts down the inside of the board so that I could remove the middle of it. I used a drill and a jigsaw to make the last 2 cuts to remove the center. I'm going to make the bench top out of layers of plywood, so I'm going to glue and screw them together starting with 2 solid layers before layering on the layers that I cut the middle parts out of. The final layer will be made out of 2 strips of plywood that will fit into the recesses that I made in the concrete. I used my drill and jigsaw to cut notches out of these pieces as well. I cut some scrap pieces of plywood to make sure that the bench wouldn't slide. I then took the middle pieces that I cut out of the other boards and cut 4-inch long sections of them. I then glued 3 of these pieces together at a time. Now when you clamp these down, the glue sometimes can make the pieces slide, which makes it a little bit difficult to keep them in line. Thankfully, my friend Mike Montgomery from Modern Builds told me this really cool tip about sprinkling table salt onto the glue so that the wood doesn't slide. It gives it a little bit of grit and it works really well. I used my orbital sander to sand all the edges of the bench smooth. I also sanded down the edges of the 4 little blocks that I made. I screwed some hinges onto the blocks. These blocks are going to be fold out supports that give the bench a little bit of extra height when it's on the ground so that there's room for my elbows to go down. I want the blocks to stay in the position that I set them in, so I'm using a combination of large magnets, which I'm going to recess into the wood, and steel plates for the magnets to stick to. Now I have supports that can add the extra height, but then also disappear underneath the bench. If all the weight consistently went onto the magnets, I think they would break over time, so I used some hot glue to make some little bumpers that would cushion the supports. I finished the bench with 2 coats of Minwax polyacrylic. I didn't want the concrete to scratch my floors, so I used my hot glue gun to lay down some little bumpers that would stick to the concrete. Now for sure, there are some simpler and easier ways to make a more functional weight bench, but I live in a loft, so I wanted a piece of furniture that would actually look nice as a real piece of furniture, and I can do exercises with it. Now the concrete and bar only weigh about 100 pounds combined, but I can add additional pipes onto the couplings and add traditional weight plates. For more detailed instructions, check out my website, and if you want to see what I'm working on next, be sure to follow me on Instagram. To learn more about the concrete products that I use, check out Quikrete.com. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Thanks. Bye.